In 1367, Denmark made a critical mistake. They tried to tax Hanseatic League ships passing through the Danish Straits. The League's response? They assembled a fleet, defeated the Danish Navy, and occupied Copenhagen. The peace treaty didn't just eliminate the tax. It gave the League veto power over Danish royal succession. For the next 70 years, Denmark couldn't crown a king without approval from a collection of merchants. That's what happens when you control the warehouses and the infrastructure of international trade. I'm Ari Van Gemeren, and I welcome you to The Timeless Investor. Today, we're diving into the story of the Hanseatic League, the most successful property empire in history that nobody really talks about. No kings, no emperors, just German merchants who understood something fundamental. Controlling where goods get stored is oftentimes more powerful than controlling the goods themselves. This is the story about how boring real estate, warehouses, docks, storage facilities built an empire that lasted 500 years, and it's probably the best argument I've ever heard and the best argument ever made for patient, infrastructure-focused investing. Let's dive in. I want to start by painting you a picture of Northern Europe, circa 1100 AD. Trade was absolute chaos. Every city had different laws, different currencies, different weights and measures. Pirates controlled the seas. Bandits controlled the roads. If you were a merchant trying to move goods from Russia to England, you faced about 40 different ways to lose everything and your life in the process. But beneath all this chaos, something very interesting was happening. The Baltic herring boom. Yes, herring, the fish. Not exactly the sexiest foundation for an empire. But here's the thing. Herring was medieval oil. It was the only reliable protein source that could be preserved and shipped long distances. The Catholic Church also mandated meatless days. Armies needed portable food. Cities needed stockpiles for winter. And the Baltic Sea had infinite herring. The problem, as you can imagine, wasn't catching the fish. Humans are very adept at it. We've caught fish for a very long time. The problem was storing and moving them. You needed secure warehouses in every port, standardized barrels, trusted middlemen, insurance against losses, property rights that crossed borders. Enter the Germans. In 1241, two German cities, Hamburg and Lübeck, made a deal that would accidentally create the world's most successful property empire. They agreed to protect each other's merchants and share warehouse space. Nothing fancy, just mutual defense and some shared storage. But here's what happened. Starting in Lübeck and Hamburg, German merchants began doing something I would classify as borderline revolutionary. They pooled capital to buy property collectively. Not the goods, not the ships, the infrastructure. Think about it for a second. While Italian merchants were financing kings and Dutch traders were cornering commodity markets, the Germans were buying warehouses. The most boring possible play. And no offense to our German friends out there, very German, control the infrastructure. And it worked better than anyone could have imagined. Within 200 years, this handshake agreement had evolved into something unprecedented. A distributed network of 200 cities controlling prime commercial real estate from London to Russia. At its peak, the Hanseatic League owned roughly 50 million square feet of warehouses, docks, and trading facilities. That's around 15% of Northern Europe's commercial property. For context, Prologis, perhaps the largest logistics REIT today, controls about 1.2 billion square feet of real estate. But that's in 2025, with mobile phones, internet, fast travel, and global supply chains. Adjusted for population and technology, the Hanseatic League was about 10 times more concentrated. They achieved massive scale without any of the tools we take for granted today. And they held this empire for 500 years. Never sold, only accumulated. By 1350, the League had perfected something they called the contour system. A contour was essentially a fortified compound, warehouses, living quarters, and offices that the League owned collectively in foreign cities. They had four major ones, and each tells its own story about patient capital and strategic positioning. The Steel Yard in London, bought in 1320 for what translates to about $3 million today. By 1500, It was throwing off enough cash to fund a small navy. Henry VIII eventually seized it in 1598, claiming it was worth more than most noblemen's estates. That's a good example of why one with the guns ultimately wins, despite the League's tremendous economic power. Briggen in Bergen, any Norwegian listeners can correct me on my pronunciation there, controlled the entire Norwegian fish trade, still standing today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. 7 centuries of continued operations until 1754. 7 centuries. And a beautiful and charming little beachfront place to hang out too. Peterhof in Novgorod, the gateway to Russian furs and wax. The League owned every warehouse that mattered for east-west trade, and the Kontor in Bruges, until the harbor silted up and they moved operations to Antwerp without missing a beat. Talk about flexibility. Here's the genius of the entire arrangement. These were not franchises or partnerships. The League owned them outright, collectively. No individual merchant could sell their share. Profits got distributed annually to member cities based on contribution, but the property stayed in the network forever. It's basically the REIT structure, if you think about it. The REIT structure, invented 600 years before the U.S. Congress created REITs in 1960. The League's expansion strategy was beautifully simple and absolutely ruthless. First, they'd identify a trade choke point. The Danish Straits, the Rhine River, the Russian border, anywhere goods had to flow. Then, they'd buy or build warehouses at that choke point. Not some warehouses, all the warehouses, or at least all the ones that mattered. Helps, of course, that they had endless capital, but that's the entire premise of a REIT. They'd then offer traders a deal. Use our facilities, follow our rules, pay our fees, and we will protect your goods. Security, standardization, insurance, legal protection. Don't want to use our facilities? Good luck finding the alternative. We own all of the warehouses. But here is where things got interesting, and I love this piece of the story. They didn't gouge. They charged fair rates. They provided real security, standardization, insurance, legal protection. They made themselves indispensable by being useful, not predatory. That is the eternal falling of monopolists, trying to squeeze too much out of the system. But the Hanseatic recognized how to keep their system running for the long term. And the network effect kicked in fast. More warehouses meant more traders. More traders meant more volume meant more fees, and more fees meant more property acquisition. A beautiful, virtuous, self-reinforcing cycle, something we would all love to emulate. So by 1400, if you wanted to trade between Eastern and Western Europe, you essentially had to rent from the League. There were no alternatives. They owned every warehouse that mattered in every port that counted. And they had effectively cornered one of the most important markets in the world, the physical storage and security of important assets, like herring. So let's talk about the numbers. By 1450, the League was generating about 1 million marks annually. That's roughly $10 billion in today's dollars, from warehouse fees, dock charges, and trading commissions. Now, if you don't think 10 billion is a lot in today's money, consider today we have a fiat operating system and our currency is wildly devalued. That is the equivalent of 10 billion today, but when money counted for a heck of a lot more. So huge deal. Their operating margins were about 60%. It's better than a lot of tech companies. Distribution yield to member cities often ran in the 8 to 12% range annually for centuries. Duration of returns, five centuries. The balance sheet was even more impressive. They owned prime waterfront property in 200 cities. They controlled 3,000 ships. They had exclusive trading rights with multiple kingdoms. Total asset value in today's dollars, north of $500 billion. And remember, no single owner, no emperor or king to confiscate it. Well, except Henry VIII, I suppose. But largely it was just a distributed network of merchant cities, each protecting the collective interest because the collective interest aligned with their individual interest. It is perhaps the most successful example of collective ownership in history, and nobody talks about it. Another analog here might be a, public stock company where you have many different distributed owners. But in this case, the owners are all mutually incentivized and helping run the network. It's an incredibly effective system if you really take a second to contemplate it. Now, you might be thinking, all right, so they own some warehouses. How did they protect them? How do they enforce their rules? The league wasn't just merchants playing with warehouses, they had teeth. And remember the era we're talking about. I mean, hell, today too. You got to have teeth, right? You got to have teeth then. You got Vikings, you got bandits, you got raiders, you got all kinds of stuff going on. Rebellious kings that don't like your revenue. We have the same thing today. And major corporations today arguably still have teeth. The teeth look a little different, but they still fight back. They bite back. You know what I'm saying? So let me give you some examples. We mentioned it before, but it's an incredible story. I want to go into it again. In 1367, the story I opened with, Denmark tried to tax League ships passing through the straits. The League assembled a fleet, defeated the Danish Navy, and occupied Copenhagen. Talk about teeth. And for 70 years, Denmark couldn't crown a king without the League approval. In 1426, the League went to war with Poland over property rights in Prussian cities, and they won. In 1407, they fought England over trading privileges, and they won. The League's military doctrine was beautifully simple. We are not interested in conquest. We just want our property rights respected. Mess with our warehouses, we'll blockade your ports until you starve. And it worked every single time. You know how in the movie Aliens, the core premise is evil corporations taking over from governments? Well, I always say this. There's nothing invented in science fiction or fantasy that hasn't actually happened, right? You know, the Skull Cup in Game of Thrones? That is a real thing. Really happened to a Byzantine emperor. His head was turned into a skull cup. History is filled with these things. Aliens didn't come up with this idea from nowhere. We don't have to look to science fiction for it. It actually happened. The Hanseatic League was effectively a corporation that could veto royal succession and wage war to protect property rights. Anything imagined in science fiction or fantasy has probably already happened in some format throughout history. Unfortunately, nothing lasts forever, not even 500-year property empires. The League's decline started with Columbus. Once Atlantic trade routes opened in the late 1400s, Baltic commerce became a sideshow. Portuguese and Spanish traders didn't need Hanseatic warehouses. They had their own routes and their own infrastructure. Then came the nation states. Sweden, Denmark, England, they all wanted their waterfronts back. And they wanted control of their own ports. The collective structure that had been the League's strength became its weakness. Consensus among 200 cities was too slow for a rapidly changing world. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 shattered what was left. Cities had to choose sides in that devastating religious conflict. The collective broke apart. The last official Hanseatic Assembly met in 1669. Only 9 cities showed up. 9, from a network that once had 200 members. The League didn't collapse per se, it just faded into history. Many of the warehouses kept operating. The trading relationships continued. The commercial law they developed became the foundation for modern maritime law. Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen remained free Hanseatic cities until the 20th century. Bergen's Kontor operated until 1754. The physical infrastructure they built still stands all over Northern Europe. Infrastructure outlasts empires. So what can we, as modern-day investors, take from the story of the Hanseatic League? What are the timeless principles that apply to us as modern investors? The Hanseatic League controlled more wealth than many kingdoms, lasted longer than many empires, longer than the United States has been around, that's for sure, and did it all through owning boring warehouses and trade routes. They didn't bet on innovation. They didn't chase growth. They didn't speculate on commodities. They just owned the boxes where everyone else put their stuff. While Venetian merchants were financing expeditions and Florentine bankers were lending to kings, the Germans were collecting warehouse fees. Month after month, year after year, century after century. The fundamental thing that they understood is that commerce needs physical space and security and safety. If you control the space, you can control the commerce. Own what others must use. Hold what others must rent. Control what others must pass through. Never sell. It's the most boring possible strategy, and it worked incredibly well. It's also the one that lasted 500 years. Let me give you some concrete investment principles that I take away from this story. 1, own infrastructure, not inventory. The League didn't own the herring or the timber or the furs. They owned where those things had to be stored. Modern parallel, own the warehouses, not the goods. Own the data center, not the software. Own the ports, not the ships. Or in my case, own apartment complexes. It is a necessary thing at choke points, places where you can't build more of it, and people will always need something to rent. 2, position at choke points. Trade routes have natural bottlenecks. The League identified every single one and bought property there. For real estate investors today, Location isn't just important, it is everything. Supply-constrained markets with natural barriers to entry are modern choke points. Or think about trade in the modern era, right? Major West Coast cities with ports exposed to massive trade with the East are great places to invest in the long run, right? Barring a hot war or something terrible happening, which hopefully someone watching this 10 years from now, that hasn't happened. Lesson 3, network effects create compounding value. Each new contour made the network more valuable. Each new member city strengthened the collective. Modern REITs work the same way. Scale creates operating leverage, market power, and cost advantages. Seek scale whenever possible. 4, collective ownership can and does align incentives. The league's genius was that no individual could sell. Everyone was incentivized to protect the long-term value of the network. This is why the best real estate partnerships have long lockup periods and aligned interests. I would also point to the Walton family is an excellent example of no member of the Walton family can easily sell their stock. That has made Walmart remain in the family and perform incredibly well over the years because there is collective ownership across many Walton heirs, and they haven't sold it. 5, really important principle that I think a lot of people miss in our search for short-term profit. Charge fair rates and provide real value. The league didn't gouge. They made themselves indispensable by being useful. The best real estate operators today do the same. They solve real problems for their residents and their tenants, which creates sticky long-term relationships. It's a thing we're particularly focused on at my firm, Lombard Equities. We're very focused on providing value for our residents, so they feel like it's a win-win partnership. One easy example, we're rolling out a new service to all of our residents where paying rent on time translates to higher credit scores for residents. I don't know many operators doing this. It's a cost for us. We put capital into it. We believe in it because we believe happy residents that receive real value for being with us will stick around for longer and take better care of our properties. 6, defend your property rights. The league went to war when necessary to protect their warehouses. They understood that property without enforcement is worthless. This is why investing in jurisdictions with strong rule of law matters so much. I've hit this point several times in many videos. The United States remains the best place to invest capital because of our ironclad property rights. Family offices all over the globe aspirationally seek to place capital in U.S. real assets because of the protection of the law here. We have to protect that with every ounce of our breath in this country to keep this place running well and being a great place and a beacon for capital. Number 7, physical assets outlast everything else. Loans to kings got defaulted on, ships sank, commodities spoiled, but the warehouse is still standing 500 years later, 1,000 years later. Real, tangible infrastructure has permanence. Today's Hanseatic League is not a collection of medieval cities. It's REITs, sovereign wealth funds, and family offices quietly buying the infrastructure of global commerce. Blackstone owns warehouses at every major port. That's Hanseatic thinking. Singapore's sovereign wealth funds are buying ports worldwide. Same playbook, different century. The strategy hasn't changed because the principles haven't changed. Commerce still needs physical space. Goods still need storage. Trade still flows through choke points. The league proved you could build dynastic wealth through the most boring real estate imaginable. Not glamorous, not exciting, just essential. Own what others must use. Hold what others must rent. Control what others must pass through. Do that for long enough, and you don't need armies or innovations or even good luck. You just need patience and warehouses. The Hanseatic League had both for 500 years. What do you suspect the IRR was on their investment over that holding period? Probably pretty good. That's the kind of holding period that builds real wealth, just like the Grosvenor family achieved with their portfolio in Mayfair and Belgravia. Many families have achieved this exact same thing. Li Ka-shing in Hong Kong, we've covered in an earlier episode. Make sure you check it out. Very similar strategy. That is the kind of wealth that survives plagues, wars, and the rise and fall of nations. And in Li Ka-shing's case, the rise of the Communist Party. That is the kind of thinking we should all be using as timeless investors. If you made it this far in this episode, thank you. You're thinking like a timeless investor. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Hanseatic League and want more historical lessons applied to modern investing, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the algorithm show this content to more people who appreciate this kind of analysis. We release new videos and podcast episodes every week, exploring the builders, the empires, and the timeless principles that create lasting wealth. I'm also a real business operator running a $150 million plus real estate portfolio. So everything we talk about is imbued with real world experience, like stories from the front lines and the front trenches. And you can read more of my writing at The Timeless Investor on Substack, link in the description and in the pinned comment below. If you're an accredited investor interested in supply-constrained real estate with structural moats, the kind of infrastructure the Hanseatic League would understand, reach out. There's a link in the description for Lombard Equities Group. Until next time, think well, act wisely, build something timeless.